Everyone in my neighborhood thought we were idiots for buying a flood house. 2 years later they're calling me asking how I knew. I want to start with something that might sound arrogant, so I'll say it plainly and then spend the next few thousand words explaining why it isn't. I knew something my neighbors didn't. Not because I had connections. Not because someone whispered it to me. Not because I found some obscure loophole in a real estate contract or bribed a city official or hacked a database. I knew it because on a Monday morning in March, I read page 187 of a 340-page federal infrastructure document that was sitting in a public registry, available to anyone with an internet connection and the patience to get through 186 pages of environmental boilerplate first. That document changed the financial trajectory of our lives. And the thing I think about most, even now looking back, is that it didn't have to be me. It could have been anyone. My name is Marcus. I'm 34 years old. I'm a civil engineer, 9 years into a career working for a municipal infrastructure consulting firm in Nashville, Tennessee. My wife, Claire, is 31. She teaches high school math. Together, we make a comfortable living, comfortable enough that we've been renting a decent 2-bedroom apartment for $1,680 a month, watching Nashville's property market do what Nashville's property market does, which is to say, accelerate away from us like a car we were never quite fast enough to catch. That Monday morning in March, I was reviewing a 340-page environmental impact assessment for a client project, a drainage corridor realignment for a suburban municipality east of the city. Routine work. The kind of document I read the way other people scan Netflix descriptions. Quickly, efficiently, looking for the specific thing that matters and skipping everything else. I was on page 187 when I stopped skipping. The section had nothing to do with my client. It was a reference, a cross-citation, the kind of bureaucratic footnote that gets buried in appendices, to a $4.2 billion Army Corps of Engineers flood mitigation project that had been approved for the Cumberland River Basin. Levee upgrades. Retention basin construction. A permanent flood wall along a 14-mile stretch of river. Construction start, 18 months. Estimated completion, 4 years. The flood wall ran directly through a neighborhood called Riverside Flats. I closed the document. Opened Zillow. Typed in Riverside Flats, Nashville, Tennessee. If you've ever driven through Riverside Flats, your first thought is probably the same as everyone's first thought. This neighborhood should be beautiful. Craftsman bungalows built in the 1940s and 50s, the kind with covered porches and original woodwork and mature oak trees that arch over the street and meet in the middle like cathedral ceilings. Wide streets. 12 minutes from downtown Nashville. The bones of a neighborhood that, in any other zip code, would be selling for $550,000 minimum. Instead, it floods. Not historically. Not once in a generation. Repeatedly, catastrophically, in the living memory of everyone currently living there. A combination of upstream residential development, aging city drainage infrastructure, and 2 catastrophic rain events in 2010 and 2019 put 4 feet of water into first-floor living rooms. The neighborhood has flooded 3 times in the last 7 years. FEMA classifies it as Special Flood Hazard Area Zone AE, the designation that means statistically you have a 1 in 4 chance of flooding over the life of a 30-year mortgage. Flood insurance runs between $3,800 and $5,200 annually per property, depending on your elevation certificate. Half the homes on the main streets are vacant or operating as rentals. The ones that sell go for $180,000 to $240,000, roughly a third of what comparable Craftsman homes in non-flood zones trade for in Nashville's current market. I looked at those listings for a long time that Monday. Then I texted Claire, "Don't make any plans tonight. We need to talk about something." I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I do professionally, reading infrastructure documents. Not just the cross-citation I'd stumbled across, but everything attached to it. I pulled the Army Corps of Engineers project approval, a separate document, 211 pages, available through the Corps' public project database. The city's matching funds commitment, filed with Metro Nashville's Capital Budget Office and accessible through a public records request I submitted online in about 4 minutes. The engineering specifications for the flood wall itself, including the design elevations and the hydraulic modeling that established the projected flood reduction. The construction timeline broken into phases, with contract award dates and milestone deadlines. I talked to 2 colleagues who had worked on adjacent Corps projects in other Tennessee watersheds. I was careful. I framed my questions as general professional curiosity, which wasn't entirely dishonest, and I never mentioned that I was considering a personal real estate investment based on what I was reading. What I learned confirmed what the documents already showed. The Army Corps, once a project reaches this stage of approval with this level of federal funding committed, completes it. Delays happen. Cost overruns happen. 4 years becomes 5. But the wall gets built. Then I built a model. This is the part that mattered most, more than finding the document in the first place. Finding information is one thing. Knowing what to do with it requires a different kind of work. Here's what my model showed. The floodwall, if constructed as designed, would change Riverside Flats from FEMA Zone AE, Special Flood Hazard Area, to Zone X. Zone X is effectively outside the floodplain. No mandatory flood insurance. No FEMA elevation certificate requirements for lenders. The actuarial foundation of the neighborhood's depressed property values would simply cease to exist. Flood insurance premiums, from roughly $4,800 per year to approximately $800 per year. That's $4,000 annually back in the pocket of every homeowner in that neighborhood, every single year, forever. Then I looked at comparable case studies. Cities where similar Army Corps flood mitigation projects had been completed: Sacramento, Houston's Brays Bayou Corridor, parts of Louisville along Beargrass Creek. In those markets, post-project property value increases ranged from 180% to 310% within 5 years of project completion. That's not appreciation. That's reclassification. The houses don't get better. The flood risk assessment changes, and the market reprices the entire neighborhood overnight. I sat with that model for a long time. Then I took it home to my wife. Claire is a high school math teacher. She grades papers on the couch. She makes dry jokes about the central limit theorem that I find genuinely funny, which I consider a relationship green flag. She is not a civil engineer, and she is not a real estate professional, and she has never read an Army Corps of Engineers project approval document in her life. But she is precise in a way that I find steadying, particularly when I'm excited about something, which is when I'm at my least precise. She listened to everything. She asked me to walk her through the model twice. She asked clarifying questions I hadn't anticipated, about the city's political incentives to complete the project, about whether we could verify the federal funding was actually committed rather than allocated conditionally, about what the insurance market would actually do versus what I projected it would do. Good questions. The kind that tightened the model rather than breaking it. Then she asked 2 questions. How certain are you? I told her 85%. The project was approved and funded at the federal level. The city had committed matching funds. The engineering was done. But construction delays are real, cost overruns happen, political administrations change, and a project of this scale operating over 4 years carries genuine execution risk. 85% was honest. It wasn't hedging. I genuinely believed we were looking at an 85% probability that the project completed on schedule or within a reasonable variance of it. What does the other 15% look like? I told her honestly, it looks like we own a house in a flood-prone neighborhood in a declining market with expensive insurance and limited resale options. It looks like we've traded a renting lifestyle we could afford for an ownership headache we didn't anticipate. It looks like we figure it out. We rent it, we hold it, we eat the carrying costs, but the transformational upside doesn't materialize, or doesn't materialize for 10 years instead of 5. She looked at the spreadsheet on my laptop for a long time. I watched her eyes move through the numbers the way I've seen her move through student work, methodically, without rushing to a conclusion. Then she said, "Show me the houses." We looked at 14 properties in Riverside Flats over 3 weekends. We weren't shopping casually. I had specific criteria: structural integrity above the floodline, a low floor elevation that maximized the delta between current flood risk and post-project reclassification, and a property history of cosmetic flooding rather than structural damage, meaning the water had reached the interior but hadn't compromised the foundation, the load-bearing walls, or the roof. On the 3rd weekend, we found it. A 1951 Craftsman on Wheeler Street. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths. Original hardwood floors under the flood-damaged replacement flooring the previous owners had laid twice. A covered front porch that wrapped around the south corner and caught afternoon light in a way that made Claire stop walking and just stand there for a moment. The house had flooded twice, 2019 and 2022. Both times the water reached 18 inches inside the first floor. The owners had gutted to the studs after the first event and rebuilt. After the second, they'd rebuilt again using flood-resistant materials: concrete backerboard, closed-cell spray foam insulation, moisture-resistant drywall, and then, understandably and sadly, given up. Listed it at $198,000. It had been on the market for 71 days. No offers. I hired a structural engineer, not a home inspector, a licensed structural engineer, for $900. He spent 4 hours in that house. The bones were perfect. The foundation, the load-bearing walls, the roof structure, everything above the floodline was exactly what the listing described: a well-built mid-century craftsman that had been renovated twice and was waiting for someone patient enough to see what it was. I hired a licensed surveyor to update the elevation certificate for $650. The first floor sat at 2.3 feet below the base flood elevation. Under current conditions, A 1-inch to 100-year flood event reached the first floor. Under the post-project floodwall, based on the Corps' own hydraulic modeling, which I had read, the property would exit the floodplain entirely. We offered $187,000. The sellers countered at $193,000. We accepted. The financing reality was more interesting than most people expect, because it actually worked in our favor in a way that the neighborhood's terrible reputation obscured. Conventional lenders won't finance flood zone properties without FEMA flood insurance in place, so we carried $4,650 annually in flood insurance premiums from day one. That's $387 added to our monthly housing cost on top of the mortgage. Our mortgage on $155,000 at 6.9% came to $1,024 per month. Total monthly housing cost, including flood insurance, property taxes, and a modest maintenance reserve, $1,411. Our previous rent in Nashville, $1,680 per month. We moved into a 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow in Nashville, a house we owned, for $269 less per month than we'd been paying to rent an apartment. Because the flood risk was priced into the purchase price so aggressively that even the insurance premium didn't erase the advantage. Everyone thought we were making a desperate decision. We were making the most calculated decision of our lives. Update 1. Moving day and the neighbors. We moved in on a Saturday in October. By Sunday afternoon, 3 neighbors had introduced themselves. Not warmly. With the specific energy of people who feel genuinely, sincerely obligated to warn strangers who appear to be walking toward a cliff. The man across the street, I'll call him Gerald, 69, retired, who'd lived in Riverside Flats for 14 years and watched his property value fall by half, crossed his arms on our front walk and looked at me with something between pity and respect. "You seem like smart kids," he said. "I don't know why you bought this house." I thanked him. I told him we'd done a lot of research. He nodded in the way people nod when they think research cannot account for the specific stubbornness of water. A woman 2 doors down, maybe 54, who'd put her own house on the market 4 times in 6 years and watched each listing expire without an offer, came to introduce herself to Claire while I was unloading boxes. "We've tried to sell," she told Claire. "Nobody stays." A man at the end of the block, 47, lived there 11 years, flooded twice, a contractor who'd done his own repairs both times, came by in the evening and stood on the porch with a beer he'd brought as a housewarming gift. He looked at the house, then at us, then back at the house. "I respect the courage," he said finally. "I question the judgment." I smiled at all of them. I did not say anything about the document. The extended family was a more sustained experience. Claire's parents drove up from Chattanooga in November and spent the entire weekend performing a sustained wordless anxiety about the proximity of the river. Her father, a retired accountant named David, a careful man who I genuinely like and respect, pulled me aside on Sunday afternoon and told me he wanted to help us get out of this if we needed to. He said he could loan us enough to absorb the loss if we listed now, before another flood season. It was a generous offer made out of genuine love. I thanked him. I told him we were doing okay. I didn't tell him what I knew. I thought about that later, whether it was fair to keep it to myself. But I want to be precise about what I was keeping, publicly available information that I had spent 3 weeks reading and modeling. It wasn't a tip. It wasn't a leak. It was a federal document filed in a public registry, available to any American with an internet connection. The Army Corps publishes everything, every project approval, every environmental review, every construction timeline. David could have read it. His accountant could have read it. His real estate agent could have read it. Nobody read it, because it was 340 pages long and page 187 was the relevant part, and nobody reads 340-page federal infrastructure documents recreationally. That's my specific professional damage. It is not a secret. It is homework. My colleague at work, a smart man, a good engineer, heard I'd bought in Riverside Flats and said, "Man, I thought you were smart." I wanted to say, I read a 340-page federal document on a Monday morning and found a $4.2 billion reason to buy a house in this neighborhood. That's what smart looks like. It looks like homework. Instead, I just told him it had been a calculated decision and left it at that. Update 2, Year 1. Nothing happens, which is exactly what should happen. The first year is the part nobody talks about when they tell stories about smart real estate decisions, because the first year is completely unglamorous. Nothing visible happened. The floodwall construction hadn't started in our section of the river. Phase 1 was 3 miles north, a project segment that had nothing to do with Riverside Flats. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had when we bought. The listing photos on the houses for sale on our street were indistinguishable from the listing photos that had been there the year before. Empty craftsman bungalows with sun-faded paint and for sale signs that had been up so long they'd started to weather. In month 7, the neighborhood flooded. Minor, 4 inches in the crawlspace from a sustained rain event that overtaxed the city's aging storm sewer infrastructure. No interior damage. Our sump pump handled it. I sent my mother a text that said, "Minor flooding event, no damage to the house, everything is fine." She called within 4 minutes. "Marcus, I really think you should consider." "Mom, we're fine. How's Dad?" In month 9, the local news covered the groundbreaking for Phase 1 of the floodwall construction, 3 miles north, but covered. I watched the segment on my laptop in the living room of our Craftsman bungalow on Wheeler Street. Claire came in from the kitchen and sat beside me. The news anchor stood in front of a construction staging area in a hard hat that she was clearly wearing for the first time in her life. Behind her, heavy equipment was visible. Claire handed me a beer. We watched the segment. Neither of us said anything. We just watched. That's what 85% certainty feels like in real time. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like watching something proceed the way you believed it would proceed, which is its own quieter satisfaction. Update 3, Year 2. The market notices before anyone explains why. Month 15. A real estate investor from Atlanta started buying properties in Riverside Flats. Cash transactions. I could see them in the public property records, which I checked periodically because it's a professional habit. He bought 4 houses in 6 weeks. Paid above the distressed market rate but below what the neighborhood's non-flood comps would justify. He was doing math. Someone else had done the same homework, or close enough to it. The neighborhood noticed. Gerald, the man across the street who had told us we seemed like smart kids, knocked on our door on a Wednesday evening in month 16. He wanted to know if we'd heard anything. I told him I'd read that the flood protection project was moving forward on schedule, which was true. I'd been tracking the construction timeline updates in the Corps' public project database. He looked at me for a long time. Not the way he'd looked at me when we moved in, not with concern or pity. With something slower. Reconstructive. "You knew," he said. Not an accusation. A recognition. The specific expression of someone fitting pieces together. "It was in a public document," I said. He nodded. Stood there a moment longer. Then he went home. Month 19. FEMA published preliminary revised flood maps for the Cumberland River Basin. Riverside Flats was flagged for potential rezoning out of Zone AE. The methodology behind the revised maps cited the Corps project and its hydraulic modeling, the same modeling I'd been reading for a year and a half. The Nashville Business Journal ran a piece. The headline was, "Riverside Flats, Nashville's Next Hot Neighborhood?" I read it on my phone at breakfast. It described, accurately, the basic mechanics of what was happening: flood mitigation project, potential FEMA rezoning, property value implications. It didn't mention the Army Corps approval document that had been sitting in a public registry for 2 years before anyone at the Nashville Business Journal had thought to look for it. 3 real estate agents called me that week asking if I wanted to sell. I thanked all 3 of them and told them I was not ready to sell. Update 4, month 26. The number. The flood wall was 60% complete by month 26. The preliminary FEMA maps were published and public. The Atlanta investor had renovated 2 of his 4 properties and listed them, priced at levels that would have been unthinkable in Riverside Flats 24 months earlier. The market had begun adjusting to what the flood maps were confirming. I got a formal appraisal done. I did not tell Claire what I expected the number to be before the appraiser finished. I had my own projection, based on the shifting comps and the preliminary FEMA data, but I wanted the appraisal to be an independent data point. Not confirmation bias wrapped in official paperwork. The appraiser spent 3 hours in the house. She was thorough and professional. She pulled comps from Riverside Flats, from comparable non-flood zone Nashville neighborhoods, and from the 2 renovated properties the Atlanta investor had listed. She factored in the flood wall completion status and the preliminary FEMA rezoning. Appraised value, $387,000. I had paid $193,000 26 months earlier. I walked into the kitchen where Claire was grading papers at the counter. I put the appraisal printout down without saying anything. She looked at it. She looked at me. She said, "Huh." Then she went back to grading papers. That's the whole celebration. A single syllable that contained everything: satisfaction, vindication, the quiet confirmation that 85% had been enough. Some victories are so thoroughly expected that they don't feel like surprises. They feel like the end of a long calculation that you trusted all the way through. We had invested $49,000 in cash, the $38,000 down payment plus $11,000 in flood-resistant upgrades we'd done in year 1. Our equity position at month 26, net of the remaining mortgage, was $239,000. Return on cash invested, 388% in 26 months. I let that number sit in the spreadsheet for a while. Then I updated the projection to month 48, full project completion, based on comparable post-mitigation market trajectories. The range, $480,000 to $540,000. That is what a $4.2 billion infrastructure project does to a craftsman bungalow in Nashville when you buy it before anyone else reads the document. Update 5. The neighborhood transforms, and everyone has questions. Gerald listed his house in month 27. He priced it at $341,000, a number that, 2 years earlier, would have landed in his inbox as a cruelty from a Zillow algorithm. He received 3 offers. He called me the night he accepted one. "I want you to know," he said, "I'm grateful you moved in. I don't fully understand what happened, but I know you had something to do with it." I told him I hadn't had anything to do with it. The Army Corps of Engineers had something to do with it. The project engineers who designed the flood wall had something to do with it. I just read about it early. He laughed. It was the first time we'd laughed together in 2 years of being neighbors. It felt like something opening up. The woman 2 doors down, the one who'd told Claire that nobody stays, stopped Claire on the street in month 28. She wanted to know how we knew. Claire smiled and told her, "My husband reads a lot of boring documents." The woman shook her head slowly, not frustrated, just taking it in. "I need a husband like that," she said. My mother stopped calling to ask whether we'd thought about selling yet. She started calling to ask about the neighborhood, about the restoration, about the new coffee shop that had opened on the corner of Wheeler, about whether the Craftsman 2 blocks over was a good buy at its current list price. Which is its own kind of vindication. David, my father-in-law, who had offered to loan us money to absorb the loss and get out, pulled me aside at Thanksgiving, same as he'd done 2 years earlier. This time the conversation was different. He asked me if I knew of any other properties like ours in comparable situations elsewhere in the city. He said he had some savings he'd been looking for a place to put. I told him I'd look into it. I was already looking. In month 28, I refinanced. Some insurers had already begun adjusting their risk models in response to the preliminary FEMA maps. The official rezoning wouldn't be completed for another 14 months, but the market for flood insurance had started moving ahead of the bureaucracy. I dropped my annual flood insurance premium from $4,650 to $800. Monthly housing cost, from $1,411 to $1,050. I own a Craftsman bungalow in Nashville, Tennessee, 12 minutes from downtown, with a wraparound porch that catches afternoon light, for $1,050 a month. I pulled $80,000 in equity from the refinance. And I started reading the next document. Reflection. Here's what I want to say clearly, because I've thought about it a lot. What I did wasn't insider trading. It wasn't a loophole. It wasn't a connection or a leak or a relationship with someone at the Army Corps. It was homework. Public homework. The document was filed in a federal registry, accessible to any American citizen who wanted to find it. The information asymmetry that made this possible wasn't created by secrecy. It was created by the fact that federal infrastructure documents are long, technical, and boring, and almost nobody reads them recreationally. I read them professionally, and one Monday morning a cross-citation in the wrong section of the wrong EIA led me to a $4.2 billion project in a neighborhood full of undervalued craftsman bungalows. My colleague, the one who told me he thought I was smart, then 2 years later asked how I knew, asked me what document. I told him, the one that's been publicly filed for 3 years. He looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. That's the whole thing. Not luck. Not connections. Not some proprietary insight available only to people in my industry. A federal document in a public registry. The Army Corps of Engineers publishes everything, every project approval, every environmental review, every construction timeline, every engineering specification. It's all out there. It's all boring. It's all in documents that are 200, 300, sometimes 400 pages long, and page 187 might be the only page that matters for any given neighborhood in any given city. Gerald didn't read it. The woman 2 doors down didn't read it. My father-in-law didn't read it. My colleague, a civil engineer who reads these documents professionally, didn't read it in the context of his own financial decisions. I don't blame any of them. Reading 340-page federal infrastructure reports for fun is a specific kind of damage that I picked up over 9 years in this industry. It's not a skill most people have or want. I'm not smarter than my neighbors. I'm not more deserving of the outcome. I just had a professional lens that happened to be exactly the right lens for the specific opportunity, and I was sitting in front of a document on a Monday morning when the information happened to be there. The man across the street told me I seemed like a smart kid. He's lived there for 14 years. He watched his property value fall by half. The document that changed everything for his house was filed in a public federal registry 8 months before we moved in. I don't blame him for not reading it. I don't think he's less intelligent or less capable. He's a retired teacher who spent his career doing something harder and more important than reading EIAs. The information just didn't cross his path in the form he would have recognized it. That's the thing about public information. It doesn't find you. You find it. And it's usually buried in something long and technical and unremarkable, sandwiched between sections you have no professional reason to care about. Claire asked me how certain I was, and I told her 85%, and she said, I can live with 85%. That was the decision. Not my research, not my model, not my professional expertise, that was the decision. Her ability to sit with uncertainty and evaluate it clearly, the same way she evaluates a probability distribution with her students, and conclude that 85% was enough to act on given our specific circumstances and our specific risk tolerance and the specific numbers on the spreadsheet. She was as responsible for this outcome as I was. More, maybe, because the research was my job and the decision was ours and she made it with full information and clear eyes. We paid $193,000 for a house that appraised at $387,000 in 26 months. We expect it to be worth between $480,000 and $540,000 when the Army Corps project reaches full completion. We are paying $1,050 a month to own it, in Nashville, which is a fact I still find quietly extraordinary when I think about it. The neighborhood is transforming. The Craftsman bungalows on Wheeler Street are being renovated. The vacant lots are being sold. A coffee shop opened. A young couple with a dog moved into the house Gerald sold. The woman 2 doors down is renovating her kitchen. None of that happened because of me. It happened because of a $4.2 billion federal infrastructure project, 18 months of construction, and the hydraulic engineers at the Army Corps of Engineers who designed a flood wall that works. I just read about it first. I pulled $80,000 in equity at month 28 and started looking at the next infrastructure document. I'm currently on page 94. I don't know yet what's on page 187. But that's the whole method, really, patient, specific, technical reading of material that most people don't have the professional formation to engage with. It's not a secret. It's not a strategy that requires special access. It's just homework. It fits on a post-it note. Read the boring documents. Everything else is math. My wife can help you with the math. She grades on a curve.